Everyone laughed at the Texas rancher's trash-filled warehouse, until his dog dug in one corner. The Texas panhandle sun has a way of bleaching the world, stripping the color from everything but the sky. It was just past dawn, and that sky was a bruised purple giving way to a fierce molten orange on the horizon. Out here near Amarillo, the land is so flat you feel like you can see the curve of the earth, a long, unbroken line where prairie grass meets forever. I sat on the porch steps of the house my great-grandfather built, the wood worn smooth by a century of master's family boots. The air was cool for now, carrying the scent of dust, sweet grass, and the faint, earthy smell of our Hereford herd grazing a mile to the east. In my hand, a tin mug of coffee, black and strong enough to float a horseshoe, warmed my palms. At my feet, Duke lay with his head on his paws, his black and white coat a stark contrast to the red dirt. But he wasn't resting. His sharp Border Collie eyes were fixed, his ears twitching, tuned to a frequency only he could hear. Duke wasn't just a dog, he was my partner, the silent foreman of this ranch. He could read a herd of cattle better than most men I knew, and he could read me even better. We shared a language that didn't need words, built on years of shared sunrises, blizzards, and the quiet, unending work of keeping this land alive. It was a legacy I carried heavy on my shoulders. The master's ranch, carved out of raw prairie in the 1880s, was my life's work, just as it had been for my father and his father before him. But times were changing. The price of beef was a fickle beast. Droughts were getting longer, and the world was closing in. Every time I drove into town, I'd see another for sale sign on a piece of land that had been in a family for generations. I was 48 years old, and the fear of being the one to lose it all was a constant bitter taste in the back of my throat. My gaze drifted to the warehouse. It stood about 100 yards behind the house, a long, rust-streaked metal building that had seen better days. Decades better. It was my grandfather's catch-all, then my father's, and now mine. Inside was a graveyard of ranching history. Broken plows, petrified bags of feed, tangled knots of barbed wire, old saddles with cracked leather, and mountains of junk that nobody ever had the time or the heart to throw away. The folks in town had a good laugh about it. "Cole, you ever gonna clean out that museum of yours?" They'd josh at the feed store. Could probably find a Model T in there if you dug deep enough. They called it Cole's trash heap, a monument to stubbornness and neglect. I usually just shrugged it off. There was always more important work to do. Fences to mend, cattle to check, a windmill pump to fix. The warehouse could wait. It had been waiting for 50 years. It could wait a little longer. Duke suddenly lifted his head, a low whine rumbling in his chest. He stood up, shook himself from nose to tail, and trotted purposefully toward the warehouse. This wasn't his usual morning patrol. There was an urgency to his gait, a focus in his intelligent eyes that snagged my attention. I watched him disappear through the permanently open sliding door. I took another sip of coffee, expecting him to come trotting back out with a rat he'd cornered. But he didn't. Instead, I heard a sound that made me stand up, a frantic, rhythmic scratching. I set my mug down and walked across the hard-packed dirt yard, my boots kicking up little puffs of red dust. The morning sun cast my long shadow ahead of me. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick and still, smelling of rust, old oil, and dry rot. Sunlight streamed through grimy windows and holes in the roof, illuminating floating dust motes like tiny golden insects. And there, in the far back corner, a corner I hadn't looked at in years, was Duke. He was digging. Not just sniffing or pawing, but digging with a possessed intensity, his powerful front legs sending dirt and debris flying. The floor in that section was just compacted earth, hard as concrete from decades of pressure. "Duke! Hey! What have you got there?" I called out. He ignored me. His focus was absolute. His whining grew more insistent, a high-pitched, desperate sound. He'd pause, jam his nose into the shallow hole he'd made, and then start digging again, his whole body trembling with effort. "Easy, boy. Leave it." He stopped for a second, looked back at me, his eyes wild with purpose, and then let out a sharp bark before resuming his work. It was the bark he used when a stubborn heifer broke from the herd, the one that meant business. I'd never seen him like this, not over a gopher or a snake. This was different. A prickle of unease ran up my spine. I walked over, stepping around a stack of dry, rotted tires and a dismantled engine block from my dad's old Ford. The corner was piled high with junk. Leaning against the wall were 3 rusted 55-gallon drums, and in front of them, a heap of toppled wooden crates, their slats splintered and gray. Duke was digging right at the base of the wall, wedged between a drum and the pile of crates. All right, I see you're serious," I muttered, more to myself than to him. "Let's see what all the fuss is about." I grabbed one of the barrels. It was heavy but empty. With a grunt, I dragged it aside, the metal scraping and groaning against the floor. I moved the other 2, revealing a section of the corrugated metal wall I hadn't seen since I was a boy. Then I started on the crates. They were filled with old glass bottles, mason jars mostly, cloudy with a century of dust. I tossed them aside, the sound of my labor echoing in the cavernous space. Duke never stopped, his digging growing more frantic as I cleared the area. Finally, I had a small space cleared. Duke had managed to claw a hole about 6 inches deep in the packed earth. It was nothing, really, but his certainty was unnerving. I knelt, running my hand over the hard ground. It was just dirt. Nothing more. "Duke, there's nothing here, boy," I said, trying to calm him. He nudged my hand hard with his nose, then barked again, looking from me to the hole and back again. He was trying to tell me something, and I'd learned long ago to trust this dog's instincts more than my own eyes. My gaze drifted up from the floor, following the line of the wall. Above the spot where he was digging, about eye level, was a heavy wooden support beam, a rough-hewn piece of timber dark with age. It was notched to support a crossbeam for a loft that had rotted away long ago. Something about it looked odd. A small section, no bigger than my hand, seemed to have a different grain, a slightly different color. Curiosity finally getting the better of me, I ran my calloused fingers over it. It was smooth, too smooth. I pressed on it. There was a faint give. My heart gave a little kick. Using my pocket knife, I worked the blade into a thin crack I hadn't seen before and pried. A small wooden plug, cut to match the grain, popped out and fell to the floor. Inside was a hollowed-out cavity, and tucked neatly inside that cavity was a small, rolled-up cylinder of oilcloth tied with a brittle piece of twine. My breath caught in my throat. Duke stopped digging and sat back on his haunches, watching me, panting softly as if to say, "See, I told you." My hands, usually steady from a lifetime of hard work, trembled slightly as I reached in and pulled the object out. The twine disintegrated into dust the moment I touched it. I carefully unrolled the oilcloth on my knee. Inside was a map. It was drawn in faded brown ink on a piece of yellowed, brittle parchment. It was a map of the master's ranch, but not as I knew it. The lines were cruder, the scale approximate, but I recognized the general shape, the curve of Prairie Dogtown Fork Red River to the north. But there were differences. A boundary line on the far western edge was drawn a full half-mile farther out than our current fence line. And there, near an ancient, dry creek bed marked as Ghost Creek, was a small, unmistakable X. In the corner, in my great-grandfather Jedediah's cramped, spidery handwriting, were the words, April 1923, hold fast. I stared at it, the musty smell of old paper filling my nostrils. The jeers of the townsfolk about my trash heap faded into silence. This wasn't just junk. This was a message, lost for 100 years, and my dog, my loyal partner, had just led me straight to it. The weight on my shoulders suddenly felt different. It wasn't just the burden of survival anymore. It was the thrill of a mystery. The next few days were a blur of chores done on autopilot. My mind was consumed by the map. I'd spread it out on the kitchen table every night, the single bare bulb overhead illuminating its secrets. Duke would lie under the table, his presence a comforting weight against my boots. Hold fast. What did Jedediah mean? Why was the boundary line different? And what in the world was at that X? The western boundary was the most puzzling part. That half-mile stretch of land was currently part of the Henderson Ranch. The Hendersons had been our neighbors for as long as the Masters had been here, but the current generation, led by a slick city slicker named Mark Henderson, was a different breed. He'd inherited the land from his father 2 years ago and saw it not as a legacy, but as a commodity. He'd already sold off water rights to a fracking company and was always making passive-aggressive comments about how my traditional methods were inefficient. He'd made a few offers on our land, low-ball offers that were more insult than business. The thought that a piece of his land might actually be mine sent a jolt of something fierce and protective through me. I decided to start at the Potter County Courthouse in Amarillo. I left the ranch in the capable hands of my oldest ranch hand, Miguel, a man whose family had worked for mine for 3 generations. Duke, of course, came with me, sitting shotgun in my dusty Ford F-250, his head out the window, lapping at the Texas wind. The courthouse was a grand old building of limestone and granite, a testament to a time when civic pride was measured in stone. Inside, the records office smelled of old paper and floor wax. A young clerk with a bored expression pointed me toward the land deed archives, a stuffy room filled with massive leather-bound ledgers. "Everything from before 1950 is in the books," she said, snapping her gum. "Anything newer is on microfilm. Good luck." For hours, I pored over the records. My fingers, thick and calloused, felt clumsy turning the delicate, brittle pages. I traced the history of Parcel 4B, the Masters Ranch. There it was, the original homestead grant from 1888. I followed the deeds of sale and transfer, my father's name, my grandfather's. I found the record from 1925, where my great-grandfather sold a section of land to the Hendersons' great-grandfather. But it wasn't the western parcel. It was a smaller piece to the south. I couldn't find any record of the western boundary changing. It was as if our fence line had just migrated. Frustrated, I leaned back, the old wooden chair creaking in protest. My head ached from squinting at the looping, cursive script. It was a dead end. As I was packing up, the county clerk, a woman named Shirley, who was nearing retirement and knew every family history in the county, walked by. "Find what you were looking for, Cole?" she asked, her voice kind. "Not sure what I'm looking for, Shirley. Just chasing a ghost, I think." I showed her the map, or rather, a photo I'd taken of it on my phone. She peered at it over her glasses. "Well, that's Jedediah's handwriting, all right. Mean as a rattlesnake, that one. But he knew this land." "Ghost Creek, nah? My granddaddy used to tell stories about that place. Said it was an old outlaw hideout back in the day. Said they'd stash their loot there before riding into Amarillo." She chuckled. Probably just old man's talk. Outlaw loot. The idea was so far-fetched, I almost laughed. But the words stuck with me. Stash. On the drive home, with Duke asleep on the seat beside me, I thought about Jedediah. He came of age during the first Texas oil boom, the 1920s, a time of wildcatters and roughnecks, when fortunes were made and lost overnight. He wasn't an outlaw, but he was a shrewd, tough man who'd survived depressions, droughts, and blizzards. He wouldn't be hiding stolen gold, but he might hide something else, something he thought was valuable. That evening, I was feeling the familiar pull of despair. The map felt like a dead end, a historical curiosity with no bearing on the present. As I was feeding the horses, Mark Henderson's shiny new pickup truck came roaring down my drive, kicking up a plume of dust that settled on everything. He got out, dressed in pressed jeans and a starched shirt that had never seen a day of real work. "Cole," he said, Not as a greeting, but as a statement. Just had my surveyors out. Looks like that old fence line of yours on our shared boundary is getting a little wobbly. Might be time to put in a new one. On the proper line, of course. My fence is fine, Mark, I said, my voice tight. Is it? He gave a thin smile. My records show the line is about 20 feet east of where your posts are. Not a big deal, but you know, property is property. He then gestured toward the warehouse. Speaking of which, that thing is a real eyesore. If you ever decide you want to clear out that corner of your property, I'd be willing to take that warehouse and the 10 acres around it off your hands, help you clean things up a bit. His condescension was like a spark on dry tinder. He wasn't just talking about a fence line or a building. He was talking about my history, my family. He was calling my legacy junk. The fence is where my father built it, and where his father built it before him, I said, my voice low and steady. And that warehouse isn't for sale. Not now. Not ever. He shrugged, his smile never reaching his eyes. Suit yourself. Just trying to be a good neighbor. But that fence is moving, Cole. One way or another. He got back in his truck and sped off, leaving me standing in a cloud of his dust and my own anger. His visit lit a fire under me. This wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was a fight. That night, I didn't look at the map. I went to the attic, a place I hadn't been in since my mother passed. The air was thick with the smell of cedar and thyme. In an old leather trunk beneath my mother's wedding dress and my baby photos, I found it, Jedediah's family Bible. It was a massive book, the leather cover cracked and peeling. Tucked inside the front cover was a letter, folded and sealed with wax that had long since crumbled. It was dated April 1923, the same as the map. It was addressed to his son, my grandfather, but it had clearly never been delivered. My hands shook as I unfolded it. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. To my son, Thomas. It began. The world is going mad for oil. Men are becoming millionaires on what lies beneath the dirt they once cursed. I have seen it with my own eyes. I have found a shale seam on our western range, near the old creek bed. A good one. But the boom brings vultures. The big companies, the lawyers, they'll steal it from a small man for pennies on the dollar. And the Hendersons, they watch our land with greedy eyes. So I have filed the claim under a different name, a shell corporation, and hidden the deeds. I will not record it with the county until the time is right, when the vultures have moved on, and we have the strength to work it ourselves. The map shows the spot. The proof is buried with the claim. If something happens to me, this is for you. Don't let them take what is ours. The land provides, but you have to know where to dig. Hold fast. It all clicked into place. The strange boundary, the X, the secrecy. Jedediah hadn't sold that land. He'd hidden a treasure right under everyone's noses. Not gold, but black gold. Texas tea. He had died of a sudden heart attack in 1924, a year after writing that letter. He never got the chance to tell his son. The secret died with him, and the letter and map were forgotten, tucked away in a Bible and a wall beam. For 100 years, the truth had been sitting right here, waiting. And Mark Henderson wanted to move the fence. He wasn't just grabbing 20 feet of grazing land. He was encroaching on the very spot marked on the map. He must have done his own research, found some old geological survey, and suspected something was there. His offer to buy the warehouse and the surrounding acres wasn't a whim. It was a calculated move to get closer to the creek bed. A thunderstorm was rolling in from the west, the sky turning a bruised, angry purple. The wind was picking up, rattling the old windows of the house. I looked at Duke, who was watching me, his head cocked. "Well, boy," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "I think it's time we went for a ride, and we'd better hurry." We rode out as the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, kicking up the scent of wet dust from the parched earth. I was on my best quarter horse, Surefoot, with Duke loping effortlessly alongside. I had the map tucked in my shirt pocket and a shovel and a pickaxe tied to my saddle. We headed for the western fence line, toward Ghost Creek. The land out here was rougher, broken by gullies and small, rocky outcrops. The creek bed itself was a wide, sandy scar on the landscape choked with mesquite and tumbleweeds. It hadn't seen flowing water in 50 years. According to Jedediah's map, the spot was on our side of the creek, near a distinctive cluster of 3 ancient cottonwood trees that stood like skeletal sentinels against the darkening sky. On my side of the fence. For now. The wind howled, and the rain began to come down in earnest, plastering my hair to my forehead and my shirt to my back. Lightning spiderwebbed across the sky, followed by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. Surefoot grew skittish, but I held him steady. Duke, however, was unfazed. He ran ahead, his nose to the ground, casting back and forth. We reached the cottonwoods, their massive, gnarled branches groaning in the wind. This was the place. But where to dig? The X on the map was just a mark. The area was 1/4 of an acre of rock-strewn dirt. It would take a week to dig it all up. Doubt began to creep in again, cold and insistent. Was I on a fool's errand, chasing a ghost story while a storm raged around me? I dismounted, my boots sinking into the rapidly softening ground. "Find it, Duke," I said, my voice nearly lost in the wind. "Find it." He looked at me, then began to work. He wasn't digging frantically this time. He was methodical, trotting in a grid pattern, his nose vacuuming the ground. The rain was coming down in sheets now, turning the creek bed into a muddy river. I stood there, soaked to the bone, watching my dog work, my last hope resting on his uncanny instincts. He stopped suddenly, right at the base of the largest cottonwood, near a tangle of exposed roots. He sniffed intently at one spot, then looked back at me and barked once, a sharp, clear sound that cut through the storm's roar. He began to dig, not with the frantic energy of before, but with a deep, powerful certainty. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. I grabbed the pickaxe and started to break up the hard, root-choked ground next to where he was digging. The work was brutal. My muscles screamed in protest, and the rain slicked the handle of the axe. But I didn't stop. Every strike of the pick was a blow against the Hendersons, against the banks, against the encroaching world that threatened to swallow my family's legacy. After 20 minutes that felt like an eternity, the shovel struck something with a dull, metallic thud. The sound was electric. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the mud and water, and began to claw at the earth with my bare hands. Duke was right beside me, whining with excitement. My fingers closed around a cold, rusted edge. It was a box, an old iron strongbox, about 2 feet long and a foot wide. It was heavy, locked, and sealed tight by a century of rust. I used the pickaxe to pry at the lid. The metal groaned and screeched in protest. With one final, desperate heave, the rusted hinges gave way, and the lid popped open. A flash of lightning illuminated the contents. My breath hitched. It wasn't gold. It was something far more valuable. Wrapped in oilcloth were bundles of documents. I carefully lifted one out. It was a deed, a properly filed and notarized mineral rights claim for the entire western section of the Masters Ranch, registered to the Panhandle Land and Energy Corporation, Jedediah's shell company. Tucked beneath it was another document, legally transferring all assets of that corporation to his son, Thomas Masters. And beneath that were geological surveys, hand-drawn maps of the shale seam, and a thick ledger book detailing the costs of the survey and the filing fees. It was all there. Undeniable, legal proof. I was kneeling in the mud, the rain pouring down on me, laughing. It was a wild, unhinged sound of pure, unadulterated relief. I had it. Jedediah had done it. He had saved us, 100 years after he was gone. "We did it, Duke," I choked out, wrapping my arm around my muddy, soaked dog. We did it. Just then, A pair of headlights cut through the torrential rain. It was Mark Henderson's truck, bouncing and sliding over the rough terrain. He must have seen my horse or heard the noise. He skidded to a stop 20 feet away and jumped out, his face a mask of fury. "What in the hell are you doing on my land, Masters?" he yelled over the storm. I stood up slowly, the iron box in one hand, the deed in the other. I was covered in mud, drenched to the bone, but I had never felt taller. "Funny you should say that, Mark," I yelled back, my voice ringing with a newfound power. "I was just reacquainting myself with my property. Turns out my great-grandfather left me a few things. You might want to call off your surveyors. The fence isn't moving east. If anything, it's about to move a half-mile west." I held up the deed. Even in the gloom, he could see what it was. The color drained from his face. He stared at me, then at the box, then at the hole in the ground. The slick confidence was gone, replaced by a raw, sputtering disbelief. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He just stood there in the pouring rain, defeated. Without another word, he got back in his truck and tore off into the storm. I watched him go, then looked down at the box. It wasn't just about the oil or the money. It was about this land. It was about knowing deep in my bones that the story of this place was written not just in fence lines and deeds, but in the secrets kept by the earth itself. And sometimes, you just need a good dog to show you where to dig. The aftermath was quieter than the storm, but just as powerful. The next morning, I was in the office of the best oil and gas lawyer in Amarillo. He looked over Jedediah's documents with a reverence I appreciated. "Cole, this is airtight," he said, finally looking up from the century-old paper. "The Shell Corporation is sound. The transfer to your grandfather is legal, and the mineral rights claim predates any subsequent surveys. This isn't just a claim, this is a foundational right. The Masters family owns the mineral rights to that entire section, clear and free. As for the surface land, the Hendersons have been using it for a century, so they have a claim there. But the mineral wealth beneath it? That's all yours. Mark Henderson can't touch it." The news spread through the county like a prairie fire. The story of Duke and the warehouse corner, of the hidden map and the midnight search in the storm, became the stuff of local legend. The same folks who used to call my warehouse a trash heap now drove by slowly, looking at it with a new kind of respect. It wasn't an eyesore anymore. It was a landmark. A testament to the fact that our history was not dead and buried, but was sleeping just beneath the surface. Mark Henderson, true to form, tried to fight it. His lawyers sent letters, but my lawyer just sent back copies of Jedediah's perfectly executed documents. Henderson eventually backed off, pulling his surveyors and falling silent. There was nothing he could do. I didn't push the surface rights claim on the land he'd been using. The mineral rights were the real prize. It was enough to know I had won, that I had protected my family's birthright. Within a month, a small, reputable drilling company had confirmed Jedediah's findings. The shale deposit was rich. The royalties wouldn't make us millionaires overnight, but they were more than enough to secure the ranch for my lifetime and for my children's, should they choose this life. The weight on my shoulders was finally gone, replaced by a profound sense of peace. The land would remain. The Master's name would endure. To celebrate, we threw a party. Not some fancy catered affair, but a real ranch party. We cleared a space near the old cottonwoods by Ghost Creek and built a massive bonfire. Neighbors came from miles around, the same ones who had chuckled about my warehouse. They brought covered dishes and stories. Old Man Hemlock, whose family had been here as long as mine, clapped me on the shoulder. "My daddy always said your great-granddaddy was the cagiest son of a gun in the panhandle," he said, his eyes twinkling in the firelight. Looks like he was right. We ate and drank and told stories under the vast, star-dusted Texas sky. Miguel's son played the guitar, and the sound drifted out over the prairie. I looked around at the faces lit by the dancing flames, at the community that was the true heart of this place, and I felt a gratitude so deep it was almost painful. Duke was at my side, as always, enjoying the extra scraps and the friendly pats from everyone. He was the hero of the hour, and he seemed to know it, carrying himself with a quiet dignity. The next day was Sunday. We all went to the little white chapel in town, the one where generations of my family had been baptized, married, and mourned. As I sat in the familiar wooden pew, listening to the preacher talk about faith and heritage, I felt a powerful connection to Jedediah, to my grandfather, to my father. They were all there with me, in the light filtering through the stained glass windows and the quiet strength of the land they had loved. Life on the ranch went on. There were still fences to mend, cattle to work, and the endless list of chores that make up a rancher's life. But something had fundamentally changed. The constant grinding worry was gone. When I looked out over my land now, I saw not just the challenges, but the deep hidden strengths. I saw a legacy not just of struggle, but of shrewdness, foresight, and an unbreakable bond with this piece of earth. That evening, I stood on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of red and gold. The warehouse stood in silhouette, no longer a symbol of neglect, but a monument to perseverance. Duke came and sat beside me, leaning his weight against my leg. I scratched him behind the ears, his favorite spot. "You know, boy," I said softly, looking out at the endless plains that were our home. They all laughed. "But you knew better, didn't you?" He just looked up at me with those intelligent, knowing eyes, as if to say that some treasures aren't meant to be found with the eyes, but with the heart, and that the most valuable things, loyalty, heritage, and a place to call home, are the ones worth digging for. The wind picked up, whispering through the prairie grass, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a promise.